Should you plan your novel? That's a question that comes in every writer's mind at some point in their journey. It comes from reading books and seeing how focused they can be, how they can have such foreshadowing in it, and have satisfying endings, and yet when you reread that book, it all makes sense. When seeing those books, it makes sense for you to ask, maybe I should plan what happens in each chapter. Maybe I should know the ending so I can put all that foreshadowing and things that make it make sense. But then you get other famous authors like Stephen King that say they just write as it comes to their head, and that if you plan, it kills the story. So which one should you choose? Plan or pants? I've written novels in both ways, so I feel I can give you the advantages and disadvantages of both systems. And by giving you those, maybe you can make a choice of which one fits you. Let's start with the first thing that every writer does when they start writing, pantsing. What's pantsing? Well, that's just opening up Word or taking your notepad and just writing whatever comes from your brain, making the story up as you go along. Which comes to the first advantage. One of the reasons writers pants first, even when they wouldn't know what the term is because it's the most natural form of storytelling. What do you do when you have an idea? Well, you just write it. You just write what comes from your brain to the page. That feeling can be quite powerful and intoxicating. Having those words from your brain appear on the page is probably what made writing fun for you in the first place. Keep that feeling in mind, keep the pantsing feeling in mind, because it can fuel the passion and energy in your work for quite a long time. Writing can be quite exhausting. That coming up with words and storylines can take a lot of effort and a lot of brain power. It makes you think that you need the right time or the right place to have the mental capacity to do it. And usually as adults we have neither. Now the thing is, pantsing can be multiplying that exhaustion a lot. Why? Well, you gotta think about what actually is in a story. Now, a story has characters, stories, plot points, the characters' arcs, what happens, but when you're writing a story, it can also be sentences, paragraphs, words, the word choice that will illuminate those parts, those higher parts. There's almost like a higher and a lower part to storytelling. Now, when you're pantsing, you are having to come up with both of those at the same time. Think about that for a second. You're having to come up with plot points, character arcs and stories, while also coming up with the sentences and word choice that will illuminate those stories. Can you think why you might be doubly exhausted if you pants? It's such a creative load on your brain. Before we wrote down stories, we told them around the fireplace. Someone would step up and talk about a character, what they did, the trials they went through. They were probably making it up on the spot, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like they knew this person and they understood what they would do next. That's the power of natural storytelling. When you're writing from the brain to the page, it can feel like you have access to the character's thoughts, feelings, and what they would do next a lot more easily. It can mean the story feels more natural. A lot of famous authors that just write from their brain have audiences because of this fact. Those audiences love the natural storytelling that comes from that process. it feels, it doesn't feel artificial. Natural storytellers also know when to put twists and surprises in, and not knowing where the story comes in also has an advantage in this way. To the writer, it's surprising because they didn't know it was going to happen, and that surprise for the writer goes down to the reader. Sometimes when you plan, it can feel everything is too foreshadowed, and so there is no surprise. But when you pants, it's always going to be a surprise what happens. Have you ever watched or read something that you kind of liked, but when you thought back at it, it didn't really make sense? Something about the transition of scenes didn't really work, or there was elements of the story that didn't really gel together or were kind of messy. That's the problem with pantsing. It sometimes can create messy storytelling. Here's the secret of your brain. It doesn't remember things very well. A novel can be anything between 300 to 500 pages. Do you think your brain is going to remember what happened at the beginning of those pages? What happened in the middle? Remember, writing takes quite a while to do as well. You might be writing the first chapter in January and writing the 20th chapter in May. Do you think you're going to remember the important character or story details of what you wrote in January? I've had many occasions where I've written a character one way in like chapter 1 and another way in like chapter 7. And I feel like I write quite quickly, but still my brain doesn't remember a lot of these details. If you pants, this can become a problem. The storytelling can become quite messy and be a little bit here and there. You might have to edit quite a lot to smooth those messy bits out, or you might get to the end of it and despair because it all doesn't really fit. Pantsing is fun in the moment. There's something exciting about taking those ideas and words in your brain and putting them on the page. Seeing the characters come to life, interact with people, and deal with that drama. Pantsing can also mean that you are surprised by every twist and turn that happens to you. Remember, you're just writing as it comes to you, and so if something unexpected happens, you also think it's unexpected. You are almost being a reader to your own story, and that can be quite fun. And that fun can trickle down to the reader. They feel the fun that you're having and the passion, and it might imbue them with that into the story. And that's the key word, fun. Writing should be fun. Remember, for most of us, this is just going to be a hobby. If it's not fun, why are we doing it? And even if we get to that hallowed stage where it becomes a job, we want it to be a job because it's different from that boring old job that we have. We want that job to be fun. And we can make it fun by pantsing. We can be excited and surprised by our own story by just writing it down and not caring about what happens next. This is the really big disadvantage of pantsing, and I think what makes every writer consider planning at some point in their journey. When you've written enough novels or you've been in the writing community enough, you notice that there's many major milestones while writing that can stop people dead. That's usually the introduction, the middle bit of the story, or when you get to about 3/4 of the way through. What happens next is usually why they stop. The problem with introduction. You've introduced the characters, you've introduced an element of the story, but then you ask, well, what happens next? You may have an idea for an ending, but you can't jump to that ending. That doesn't feel satisfying and it doesn't fill those pages. So that what happens next can make you stop dead. What the hell is this story? I don't know. It's kind of the same with the middle bit of the story. You might have like about 100 or 200 pages that you need to fill up, but you don't know how to fill that up. Again, like the introduction, you feel like you can't skip to the end, but you feel like if you just add anything else, it just comes across as boring filler. So what happens? You stop. And on that 3/4 of the way mark, well, sometimes you might not know what the ending is. You remember, you're just writing from your brain. You might not have come up with the ending, but at that point, you know you have to come up with something, and you know you have to come up with something that satisfies the audience with what's happened before, and that can be really frightening. What the hell happens at the end, and how do I make it satisfying? Ugh. Even without those major milestones, what happens next is a constant question that you're going to have to ask while pantsing. There's always the next chapter that you have to write. There's always the next scene you have to write. And sometimes you might not know what actually happens in those chapters or scenes. And it can be a constant stop and start where you're just like, what's the next chapter? I don't know. And then that stops you writing. And it could be like a few days or a week or months until you write again. And sometimes that constant worry or that constant question of what happens next can like just wear you down. Oh, why do I have to think about what happens next? And sometimes that can kill your writing of that novel, and sometimes you just stop. And sometimes if you stop at many novels, like every novel you make, you get to that introduction or that middle part and you just give up. Eventually you might give up entirely. You might just say, oh, writing is too hard, I'm just not even gonna bother. It's a real problem. What happens next is a real problem. Which takes us to planning. Now, what is planning? Well, that's just writing down what happens in the story in advance. Coming up with, whatever happens in the chapters, what happens at the end, and everything in between. Sometimes it can be a little loose and just having a bullet point for each chapter or each scene, and sometimes it can be really detailed, like basically you've kind of written a novel except for a few different pieces. But all they have in common is that you know what happens in the novel. Which comes to our first advantage of planning. All those problems you had with those milestones, what happens after the introduction, what goes in the middle, what your ending is going to be, they're all gone because you know them. You know what happens next, and you don't have to worry about it. And that can be a big weight off your shoulders. It can feel freeing. You don't have to worry again. And that powerful feeling is why writers will advocate for you to plan. They see the amount of novels that don't get finished because they go through the problems of those milestones. They see the messy storytelling that can come across when you don't plan a story. And what they want to do is they just want to put an arm around their shoulder and just say, I have a better way for you. Some writers understand the power of planning. They understand that it can help them immensely when writing a novel, and yet they can really bounce hard when they actually start doing it. Why? Because planning can suck the fun out of writing. Remember how I said that pantsing can be quite fun? That not knowing what happens can make you get into writing. You get surprised at every twist and turn. Well, planning takes that away. You always know what happens next. What you're doing with planning is kind of sacrificing that fun in the moment to make sure that your story isn't messy or that you always know what happens next. And some writers just don't like that sacrifice. They think writing should be fun. They think you should be surprised at every twist and turn because then the readers will be. They think that writing after planning can just become a tick box exercise, just going through the motions. And creativity, they would say, shouldn't really be going through the motions. When you have an idea, sometimes it can feel that idea is already fleshed out for you. You know the characters, you know what happens in the story. That hill in the novel is filled with grass and flowers, and it's all rendered in the most wonderful detail. It's only when you come to write that idea down that you realise that your brain was lying to you. That hill is not rendered in any detail. It's an impressionist painting made by a 5-year-old. The problem with that? Stories live on details. People get into the scene because you can render it in detail. That scene in the hill, you can say what the grass is like, you can say the colour of the flowers, what it smells like, and that gives you a connection to what the character is feeling and thinking. Planning can save you from that problem. You can take that scene on the hillside and figure out what the details are going to be, what the emotions the character is going to have, and you can weave all of that into the scene when you start writing it. When you pants, you might not have that idea, so you just throw details all around and it doesn't cohere into a single thing. But when you plan, you can think, okay, this scene is more romantic or this scene is more melancholy, and you can choose the details of the hillside that connect with that. Of course, knowing those details might become a problem if your brain thinks of different details while you're writing. Just because you've planned doesn't mean your creative brain has gone in the back of your mind. While you're writing, you might think of different details that you could write, and obviously you're going to have some opinions about those details. Usually your brain thinks the details you've come up now are better than the details you come up in your plan. Then you have a dilemma. Do you go with the details you made in your plan, or do you go with the details that you're writing at the moment? If you go with the details of your plan, it might seem artificial. It might not fit the character in the moment. There's a lot of criticism readers or watchers have about it feels like the stories are pushing the characters and not the other way around. And in that artificiality, they might just stop caring. Of course, if you go with details in the moment, that could make changes down the line. In an extreme example, if a parent is nice in this scene, then that later scene where the child runs away doesn't make sense anymore. Even in non-extreme examples, small changes at the start have domino effects down the line. And then you might find yourself throwing out that outline in certain places, or even throwing it out completely. Then you might ask yourself, well, why did I make that outline if it's not useful for me, if I'm just changing? And once you start asking that question, you might just go back to pantsing again. Remember that fantastic book that felt so satisfying, that had all that foreshadowing in it, that had an ending that felt surprising, and yet when you reread it, it felt natural? That is the power of planning. Because if you know what happens next, you can then plan for those scenes. You can put all the foreshadowing and all the satisfying little details that will make that ending feel surprising and yet inevitable. You can build up the character or the story along the way that you want it to. It can feel more focused. There's something quite satisfying to a book that has like a clear through line to it, where every little piece and every little character moment connects to the next in a long chain, where nothing is wasted and everything seems to fit. If you plan, you can have that feeling in your reading. Most plans are going to be a zoomed out view of the story. What do I mean? Plans are never going to be detailed. That's what writing is there for. So you're just going to have one line or maybe at most a paragraph for each chapter or scene. That means that scene is not going to have the emotional heft, the character view that a scene has. The weird thing though is when you come to write it, you might still be in that summarized view. I noticed this when I started writing after planning, is that the scene that I made wasn't actually that different from the summarized version. Yes, I added a little bit of description, a little bit of character, but it didn't have that emotional heft that I feel it should have had. This can also have a problem with you making tensions or conflict or having emotional scenes that aren't about the plot. With conflict, you know what happens next, so you know the character survives, so you think, well, what's the point of saying that there might be a chance of him dying? You know he's not going to. And with the emotional scenes, you know it doesn't have anything to do with the plot, so what's the point of focusing your attention on it? You just make it into a paragraph. But if you read novels, you know that they will tell you that a character might die in this section, and there might be chapters upon chapters of the characters going through emotional scenes, and that can be the pleasure of it. And if you're planning, you can lose that part of the storytelling, and the novel itself can become very thin and not have the emotional impact that you want it to have. So, should you plan your novel? Should you pants it? Which is the better way? What if there was a third choice? What if you could combine the advantages of planning with some of the advantages of pantsing? What if you could combine them? Sometimes it's good to know what happens next, so you can build up to those scenes, or you can add details that will make those scenes feel epic and truly satisfying to the reader. But also sometimes you need to have that freedom and to be surprised by your own story, to have that natural kind of storytelling within your story. My conclusion is that you should both plan and pants, that you should know significant moments in your story, like the ending or what's going to happen in the middle, that you should be grounded with your characters and know the kind of situation that they're going against, because that will make the whole writing easy. But you should also be free with the writing. You should be surprised by the twists and turns and just go with the flow. Be okay with changing or morphing things as you start writing. And if you combine the two, you'll have the advantages of both while taking away some of the disadvantages. You won't have a problem with what happens next because you know roughly what will happen next. You'll know the hills in the distance. But you also won't have the tick box exercise or the feeling that you're just writing the zoomed out story, because you'll be within the story as you write it. You'll make sure to keep that character and passion in mind when you start writing. Thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed yourself or if you found the tips useful in any way, please like and please subscribe to the channel where you'll find a lot of other advice and tips. And please comment down below what you use, what you found when you've planned, or what you found when you pants, the advantages and disadvantages you think are in both, and if you've gone from one to the other or vice versa, why did you choose that? I always love to hear from other writers, and I think it's always good to have a collation of different people and advice. So thanks for watching. Until next time.